Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the blood-soaked cobblestones of Paris in 1789, a city balanced on the razor's edge between civilization and chaos. This is the story of how the most beautiful city in Europe became a nightmare of starvation, violence, and revolutionary terror, a place where the smell of gunpowder mixed with human desperation, where aristocrats trembled behind locked doors, while the streets echoed with the roar of an awakening beast. This is Paris at the birth of the French Revolution, when fear itself became the most powerful force in the kingdom. Before we dive into the bloody streets of Paris, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments which country you are watching from and what time it is right now. It is always fascinating to see how history unites people from every corner of the world, especially when we explore moments that changed the course of human civilization forever. The year 1789 began like any other in the City of Light. But beneath the surface, something monstrous was stirring. Paris, with its population of over 600,000 souls crammed into medieval walls, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The winter had been brutal, the worst in living memory. Ice-cold winds howled through narrow alleyways where families huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the frigid air of their one-room hovels. But the cold was nothing compared to the hunger that gnawed at their bellies like a living thing. Picture this. You wake up in January 1789 as an ordinary Parisian worker. Your apartment, if you can call it that, is a single room shared with your spouse and 3 children. The walls are damp with condensation, and rats scurry across the floor with impunity. You have not eaten a proper meal in weeks. The price of bread, your staple food, has risen to heights that would have been unimaginable just months before. A 4-pound loaf now costs 14 sous, when your daily wage, if you can find work, is barely 20 sous. You are literally working to afford bread, and nothing else. But this is not just your story. This is the story of hundreds of thousands of Parisians who woke up each morning wondering if today would be the day they finally starved to death. The streets were filled with hollow-eyed men and women, their clothes hanging loose on skeletal frames, their children crying incessantly from hunger pangs that never ceased. This was not poverty as we might imagine it today. This was a slow, grinding apocalypse that consumed human dignity one empty stomach at a time. The contrast with the lives of the wealthy was not just stark, it was obscene. While common people literally died in the streets from starvation, the aristocracy continued their elaborate balls and feasts. The Palace of Versailles, just 12 miles from Paris, might as well have been on another planet. There, courtiers consumed more food in a single meal than entire families in Paris would see in a month. Marie Antoinette's gambling debts alone could have fed thousands of starving families for years. The inequality was not just economic, it was a moral chasm that seemed to mock the suffering of ordinary people. The city itself had become a character in this unfolding tragedy. Paris in 1789 was a maze of narrow, winding streets that had barely changed since medieval times. Most roads were unpaved, and when it rained, they turned into rivers of mud mixed with human and animal waste. The smell was overwhelming, a constant. Assault on the senses that mixed rotting food, unwashed bodies, horse manure, and the acrid smoke from countless chimneys. Windows were rare and small, keeping interiors dark even during the day. At night, the city was plunged into an almost complete blackness, broken only by the occasional flickering candle or oil lamp dot in these dark streets. Crime flourished like a disease. Theft was rampant, but it was theft born of desperation rather than greed. A mother might steal a loaf of bread to feed her children, knowing that if caught, she could face hanging. Prostitution was everywhere, as women with no other options sold their bodies for enough money to buy food for another day. Violence erupted without warning, as hungry. Desperate people fought over scraps like animals. The authorities, such as they were, had largely given up trying to maintain order in the poorest districts. The police force was small and corrupt, more interested in protecting the wealthy neighborhoods than venturing into the slums where real suffering festered. This created pockets of lawlessness where only the strongest survived, and where justice was dispensed by whoever held the biggest stick. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the silence of the government. King Louis XVI, weak and indecisive, seemed paralyzed by the mounting crisis. His finance ministers came and went like seasonal changes, each one unable to solve the fundamental problem. France was bankrupt. The kingdom had spent enormous sums fighting wars, particularly supporting the American Revolution, and now the bills were coming due. The irony was bitter. France had helped America achieve liberty while its own people suffered under an increasingly oppressive system. The tax system was a nightmare of inequality and inefficiency. The wealthy nobility and clergy paid almost nothing, while the burden fell entirely on the common people who could least afford it. Imagine being told that you must pay crushing taxes while watching the richest people in your society live tax-free lives of unimaginable luxury. The psychological impact was as devastating as the economic one. It sent a clear message: your suffering does not matter, your life has no value. You exist only to serve those above you. As winter gave way to spring, the situation did not improve. If anything, it got worse. The previous year's harvest had been poor, and grain supplies were running dangerously low. Bread riots began to break out with increasing frequency. These were not organized political protests. They were primal explosions of human desperation. Hungry crowds would descend on bakeries like locusts, taking whatever they could find. The bakers themselves were often as desperate as their customers, caught between starving neighbors demanding bread and suppliers demanding payment they could not afford. The rumors that spread through the city were like poison in the bloodstream of Paris. People whispered that the nobility was deliberately hoarding grain to drive up prices. Others claimed that foreign armies were preparing to invade and make the suffering even worse. Some said the king was planning to flee the country, abandoning his people to their fate. Whether these rumors were true mattered less than the fact that people believed them. In a city where information was scarce and fear was abundant, wild stories spread faster than fire. The fear was not confined to the poor districts. In the wealthy neighborhoods, behind the walls of their elegant mansions, the nobility was beginning to realize that something fundamental was changing. They could hear the angry voices in the streets growing louder each day. They could see the hostile looks from servants who had once been obedient and deferential. Some began to hire additional guards or make preparations to leave the city altogether. The smart ones understood that when people have nothing left to lose, they become capable of anything. Religious tensions added another layer of complexity to the crisis. The Catholic Church owned enormous amounts of land and wealth while preaching to congregations of starving people about the virtues of suffering and patience. The hypocrisy was not lost on ordinary Parisians who watched bishops arrive at church in golden carriages while children begged for scraps outside. Some priests tried to help their communities, using church resources to feed the hungry. But they were exceptions rather than the rule. The intellectual climate of the city was equally volatile. Coffee houses and salons buzzed with dangerous new ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and social contracts. Writers and philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau had planted seeds of thought that were now growing into revolutionary consciousness. Books and pamphlets critical of the monarchy circulated secretly, passed from hand to hand like contraband. The ideas were intoxicating. What if kings were not appointed by God? What if all men were truly created equal? What if the people had the right to overthrow tyrannical governments? These ideas found fertile ground in the desperate soil of Parisian suffering. When people are watching their children starve while aristocrats feast, abstract philosophical concepts about equality and justice become concrete, urgent realities. The gap between Enlightenment ideals and lived experience created a pressure that had to find release somewhere. The spring of 1789 brought not relief but escalation. Food shortages continued to worsen, and the government seemed increasingly helpless to address them. King Louis XVI made the fateful decision to call the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met for 175 years. This was meant to be a way to address the financial crisis, but it opened a door that could never be closed again. For the first time in generations, ordinary people had a formal voice in government, and they intended to use it. The lead-up to the Estates General created a fever of expectation and anxiety throughout Paris. Representatives were chosen, grievances were compiled, and suddenly everyone was talking about politics. The Third Estate, representing everyone who was not nobility or clergy, began to realize their potential power. They represented 98% of the population, but had been systematically excluded from real political influence for centuries. The meetings of the Estates General, which began in May 1789, quickly revealed the fundamental incompatibility between the old system and the new reality. The nobility and clergy expected to continue their dominance, while the Third Estate demanded real representation proportional to their numbers. When the traditional system failed to accommodate these demands, the Third Estate took the revolutionary step of declaring themselves the National Assembly and swearing the tennis court oath, pledging to create a new constitution for France. This was not just a political maneuver. It was a declaration of war against the entire system that had oppressed the French people for centuries. In the streets of Paris, news of these developments spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered to hear the latest updates, and the mood grew more militant by the day. People began to talk openly about overthrowing the monarchy, about seizing the property of the wealthy, about creating a completely new society based on equality and justice. The government's response was predictably heavy-handed and counterproductive. Instead of trying to address the legitimate grievances of the people, Louis XVI began massing troops around Paris. Foreign regiments were brought in, soldiers who would presumably have fewer qualms about firing on French citizens. This military buildup had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of intimidating the population into submission, it convinced them that the king was preparing to use force to crush their hopes for reform. The presence of foreign troops in the streets of Paris created an atmosphere of barely contained violence. Soldiers and citizens eyed each other with mutual suspicion and hostility. Incidents began to occur, small confrontations that could have exploded into larger conflicts at any moment. The city felt like a battlefield waiting for the first shot to be fired. On July 11th, 1789, the king made another catastrophic mistake. He dismissed Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister who was seen as sympathetic to the common people. News of Necker's dismissal reached Paris within hours. and the reaction was immediate and furious. Crowds poured into the streets, not just to protest, but to prepare for what they saw as an inevitable confrontation with royal forces. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity as Parisians prepared for what felt like an approaching war. Weapons were gathered from wherever they could be found. Blacksmiths worked around the clock to forge pikes and other crude arms. Barricades began to appear in the streets, constructed from furniture, cobblestones, and anything else that could stop a cavalry charge. The city took on the appearance of a fortress under siege, but the siege was not being conducted by foreign enemies. It was a civil war between the people of Paris and their own government. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. These were not abstract political disputes being argued in comfortable meeting rooms. This was about survival, about whether ordinary people would have any say in the conditions of their own lives, about whether centuries of oppression would continue or finally end. The clergy and nobility, sensing the changing mood, began to panic. Some fled the city entirely, heading for friendlier territories where revolutionary ideas had not yet taken root. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, hoping to wait out what they assumed would be a temporary outburst of popular anger. They fundamentally misunderstood what was happening. This was not a riot that would burn itself out in a few days. This was the birth of a new world, and the old world was fighting desperately for its survival. The morning of July 14th, 1789, dawned grey and tense. Paris had barely slept, and the streets were filled with armed citizens preparing for they knew not what. Rumors flew through the city like birds of prey. Some said the king's troops were preparing to attack the city. Others claimed that foreign armies were marching on Paris. The truth was almost irrelevant. The fear and anticipation had taken on a life of their own. The crowd that began to gather that morning was unlike anything Paris had ever seen. These were not professional soldiers or trained revolutionaries. They were ordinary people, shopkeepers and craftsmen, servants and laborers, who had decided they could no longer tolerate the intolerable. They carried whatever weapons they could find: kitchen knives, farming tools, hunting rifles, improvised, clubs. Most had no military training whatsoever, but they had something more powerful than training. They had nothing left to lose. The target that emerged from the chaos of that morning was the Bastille, an ancient fortress that had become a symbol of royal oppression. The Bastille was not chosen for strategic reasons. It contained only a handful of prisoners and was not particularly important militarily. But symbols matter in revolutionary moments, and the Bastille represented everything the people of Paris hated about the old regime. It was a place where people disappeared without trial, where royal justice was dispensed in darkness and secrecy. The fortress itself was an imposing sight, with walls 80 feet high and 10 feet thick. It had been built in the 14th century to defend Paris from English invasion, but by 1789 it had become a prison for political enemies of the crown. The Marquis de Sade had been imprisoned there, along with countless others whose only crime was opposing royal authority. To the crowd gathering outside its walls, the Bastille was not just a building. It was the physical embodiment of tyranny. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard René de Launay, found himself in an impossible position. He had a garrison of fewer than 100 men facing a crowd that eventually swelled to nearly 1,000 armed and furious Parisians. His orders were to defend the fortress, but against what? This was not an invading army following the conventional rules of warfare. This was a popular uprising driven by centuries of accumulated rage and desperation. The negotiations that took place between the crowd and the fortress defenders were tense and confused. The people demanded the surrender of the gunpowder stored inside, claiming they needed it to defend themselves against royal troops. Delaunay was willing to consider this, but he could not open the gates without risking a complete loss of control. Both sides were trapped by the logic of their positions, neither able to back down without losing face. What happened next was almost inevitable given the circumstances. Someone, history is not clear who, fired the first shot. It might have been a defender on the walls or an attacker in the crowd. The identity of the shooter mattered less than the psychological impact of the gunfire. Suddenly, this was not a negotiation or a protest. This was war. The assault on the Bastille was chaotic and bloody. The attackers had no coherent plan, no unified command structure, no clear strategy beyond getting inside the fortress. They surged forward in waves, driven by fury and desperation rather than military tactics. The defenders, outnumbered and isolated, fought back as best they could, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the assault. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets of Paris, drawing more and more people to the scene. This was not just an attack on a building, it was the sound of the old world dying. Every shot fired was a rejection of royal authority, a declaration that the people would no longer accept their assigned role as passive subjects of an absolute monarch. The breakthrough came when a group of French guards, professional soldiers who were supposed to be defending the monarchy, joined the attackers. These men brought military expertise and, more importantly, cannons to the assault. The psychological impact of seeing royal soldiers turn against the crown was enormous. If the king's own troops were joining the revolution, what hope did the old regime have? The final assault was swift and decisive. The defenders, recognizing that further resistance was futile, agreed to surrender in exchange for promises of safe passage. But crowds driven by revolutionary fervor are not always interested in honoring such agreements. When the gates finally opened and the attackers poured inside, the mood was one of savage triumph rather than merciful victory. Governor Gillard was dragged from the fortress and through the streets of Paris in what became a grotesque parade of revolutionary justice. The crowd, drunk on their unprecedented victory, demanded immediate retribution for years of oppression. Delaunay's head was cut off and mounted on a pike, a grisly trophy that was paraded through the city as proof that the people had finally struck back against their oppressors. The symbolism of this moment cannot be overstated. For centuries, royal authority had seemed absolute and unchangeable. Kings ruled by divine right, and questioning their authority was not just treason but blasphemy. But here, in the streets of Paris, ordinary people had stormed a royal fortress, defeated its garrison, and executed its commander. The psychological barrier that had separated ruler from ruled had been shattered forever. News of the fall of the Bastille spread through Paris with supernatural speed. Church bells rang out across the city, not in celebration of religious observance, but in revolutionary triumph. Crowds poured into the streets, embracing strangers and weeping with joy. For the first time in their lives, these people felt like they had some control over their own destinies. But the aftermath of July 14th was not all celebration. The violence that had been unleashed was not easily contained. Throughout the city, score settling began as people used the chaos to pursue personal vendettas and settle old grudges. Houses, suspected of belonging to royalist sympathizers, were attacked and looted. Anyone associated with the old regime became a potential target for popular vengeance. The municipal government of Paris, such as it was, found itself in an impossible position. They had not organized or authorized the attack on the Bastille. but they could not condemn it without seeming to side with the monarchy against the people. Instead, they tried to channel the revolutionary energy into more constructive directions, organizing a citizen militia to maintain order and protect the gains that had been made. This citizen militia, later known as the National Guard, became one of the most important institutions of the early revolution. Unlike the Royal Army, which served the king, the National Guard served the people. Its members were ordinary citizens who took up arms to defend their neighborhoods and their newly won freedoms. The psychological impact of seeing armed citizens patrolling the streets was enormous. It sent a clear message that power had shifted from the monarchy to the people. But power, once unleashed, is difficult to control. The same popular energy that had conquered the Bastille began to turn on other targets. Tax collectors, royal officials, and anyone associated with the old regime found themselves in mortal danger. Some were killed outright, others fled the city in fear for their lives. The line between justice and vengeance became blurred as years have accumulated. Grievances exploded into violence. The aristocracy, who had lived their entire lives insulated from the consequences of their actions, suddenly found themselves face to face with popular fury. Their elegant mansions became targets for angry crowds. Their servants, who had once been obedient and deferential, began to look at them with undisguised hostility. Some nobles barricaded themselves in their homes, while others disguised themselves as commoners and tried to escape the city. The psychological terror of this period cannot be underestimated for people who had never questioned their position. At the top of society, the sudden reversal of fortune was traumatic beyond description. They had grown up believing that social hierarchy was natural and ordained by God. Now they were learning that hierarchy was merely a human construct that could be overturned by human action. Meanwhile, in the poorer districts of Paris, the mood was one of euphoric liberation, tempered by uncertainty about what came next. People who had been powerless their entire lives suddenly found themselves holding real influence over events. But power brings responsibility, and many were unsure how to exercise their newfound authority constructively. The economic crisis that had triggered the revolution had not disappeared with the fall of the Bastille. People were still hungry, bread was still expensive, and winter was still coming. The revolution had created an opportunity for change, but change itself required careful planning and sustained effort. The euphoria of July 14th could not be sustained indefinitely, and practical problems demanded practical solutions. The weeks following the storming of the Bastille were marked by a curious mixture of celebration and anxiety. On one hand, Parisians reveled in their unprecedented victory over royal authority. On the other hand, they wondered what would come next. The old system had been challenged, but no new system had yet emerged to replace it. France was in a state of revolutionary limbo, caught between a past that had been rejected and a future that remained undefined. King Louis XVI, faced with the reality of popular revolution, was forced to make concessions that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He traveled to Paris and appeared before the revolutionary municipal government, effectively acknowledging that power had shifted away from the monarchy. He even wore the revolutionary cockade, a tricolour symbol that represented the unity of the people, but these gestures, dramatic as they were, could not undo the psychological impact of July 14th. The monarchy had been revealed as vulnerable, and that revelation could not be taken back. The National Assembly, meanwhile, continued its work of creating a new constitution for France, but their deliberations were now taking place in the shadow of popular violence. The representatives knew that if they failed to address the grievances that had driven people to storm the Bastille, they might face the same fate as Governor Delaunay. This added urgency to their work, but also made compromise more difficult. How do you create a stable government when the streets are filled with armed citizens who have tasted blood? The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted by the National Assembly in August 1789, was an attempt to channel revolutionary energy into constructive legal and political reform. This remarkable document proclaimed that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights, a radical notion that challenged centuries of accepted social hierarchy. But declarations are one thing, and implementation is another. How do you transform a society built on inequality into one based on equal rights? The practical challenges were enormous. France's entire legal, economic, and social system was based on the assumption that people occupied fixed positions in a divinely ordained hierarchy. Nobles had certain rights and privileges, commoners had others, and clergy occupied a special position between heaven and earth. The revolution was proposing to sweep all of this away and replace it with a system based on individual merit and equal citizenship. The scope of the transformation was breathtaking and terrifying. The Church, which owned vast amounts of land and exercised enormous influence over daily life, found itself caught in a particularly difficult position. Many clergy had supported the Third Estate in the early stages of the revolution, but as the movement became more radical, they began to have second thoughts. The revolutionary government's decision to nationalize church property and require clergy to swear an oath of loyalty to the new constitution created a deep schism within French Catholicism that would have lasting consequences. The economic dimensions of the revolution were equally complex. The seizure and sale of church and noble lands was intended to provide revenue for the new government, while also creating a class of small property owners with a stake in the revolutionary system. But land redistribution is never simple, and the process was marked by fraud, favoritism, and violence. Some peasants benefited enormously, while others found themselves worse off than before. In Paris, the economic situation remained precarious throughout the remainder of 1789. The political revolution had not solved the fundamental problem of food scarcity and high prices. If anything, the disruption caused by revolutionary activity made economic problems worse in the short term. Trade was disrupted, normal commercial relationships were overturned, and uncertainty about the future made investment and long-term planning difficult. The winter of 1789-1790 was another test of the revolution's staying power. Would the popular enthusiasm that had driven people to storm the Bastille survive another season of hunger and cold? The answer was not immediately clear. Revolutionary fervor could inspire people to extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice, but it could not conjure food from empty granaries or heat from insufficient fuel. The government's attempts to address these practical problems were hampered by inexperience and conflicting priorities. The revolutionaries were experts at overthrowing the old system, but they had little experience running a modern state. They had to learn by doing, making mistakes that had real consequences for millions of people. The learning curve was steep, and the stakes were life and death. Meanwhile, the revolution was beginning to radicalize beyond the intentions of its original leaders. The bourgeois politicians who had initially led the Third Estate found themselves being pushed aside by more radical voices who demanded more extensive changes more quickly. The sans-culottes, the urban working people who had provided much of the muscle for revolutionary activities, began to develop their own political agenda that went far beyond what moderate revolutionaries were comfortable with. This radicalization was driven partly by practical necessity and partly by the internal logic of revolutionary change. Once you accept that the existing system is fundamentally unjust and needs to be overthrown, it becomes difficult to draw clear lines about how far change should go. If kings are not appointed by God, what about nobles? If nobles have no special rights, what about property owners? If property rights are not sacred, what about the entire economic system? The questions raised by the revolution were not merely academic. They had immediate practical consequences for millions of people. A merchant who had grown wealthy under the old system wondered whether his property was safe under the new one. A peasant who had gained access to land through revolutionary redistribution wondered whether he would be allowed to keep it. A worker who had joined the National Guard wondered whether his service would be rewarded or forgotten. The international dimension of the French Revolution added another layer of complexity and danger to an already volatile situation. Other European monarchies watched events in France with a mixture of fascination and horror. If revolution could succeed in France, what was to stop it from spreading to their own territories? The ideological challenge posed by the revolution was as threatening to SDS order as any military invasion. Austrian and Prussian armies began to mass on French borders, ostensibly to protect their own interests, but actually preparing for possible intervention to restore the French monarchy. This external threat had a profound impact on the internal development of the revolution. It provided a rallying point for revolutionary unity while also justifying increasingly authoritarian measures in the name of national defense. The emigration of French nobles to other countries created additional complications. These as they were known, established communities in exile where they plotted counter-revolution and sought foreign support for overthrowing the revolutionary government. Their very existence was a constant reminder that the revolution had enemies who would never accept its legitimacy and would use any means necessary to destroy it. Back in Paris, the streets remained dangerous and unpredictable throughout the latter months of 1789. The euphoria of July had given way to a more complex mixture of hope, fear, and uncertainty. Revolutionary clubs and societies proliferated, providing forums for political discussion and organization, but also creating new sources of division and conflict. The Jacobin Club, the Cordeliers Club, and dozens of smaller organizations competed for influence and membership. These political clubs were not merely debating societies. They were training grounds for democratic participation and centers of revolutionary activism. Members learned to speak in public, to organize petitions and protests, to coordinate political action across different neighborhoods and social groups. For many ordinary Parisians, participation in these clubs was their first experience of real political power. But political power, like all forms of power, could be intoxicating and corrupting. Some revolutionary leaders began to develop authoritarian tendencies, convinced that they alone understood what was best for the people and the revolution. Others became so radical that they lost touch with practical reality, advocating changes that would have been impossible to implement without destroying French society entirely. The press, freed from royal censorship, exploded with hundreds of new newspapers and pamphlets representing every conceivable political viewpoint. Marat, l'ami du peuple, the friend of the people, advocated violent measures against enemies of the revolution. Jacques Hébert's Perdution used crude language and popular imagery to communicate revolutionary ideas to working-class readers. More moderate publications, tried to chart a middle course between royalist reaction and radical excess. This proliferation of political information and opinion was both liberating and overwhelming. For the first time in French history, ordinary people had access to diverse perspectives on current events and political issues. But the sheer volume of information made it difficult to distinguish reliable reporting from propaganda and wild speculation. Rumors and conspiracy theories flourished alongside legitimate political debate. The role of women in the revolution was particularly complex and controversial. Women had participated actively in the storming of the Bastille and other revolutionary activities, but they were excluded from formal political rights under the new system. This contradiction created tensions that would persist throughout the revolutionary period. Some women, like Olympe de Gouges, demanded full political equality, while others focused on economic and social issues that affected their daily lives. The October days of 1789 provided another dramatic illustration of women's revolutionary potential. Faced with continuing bread shortages, a crowd of Parisian women marched to Versailles to confront the king and queen directly. This was an unprecedented act of political audacity, common women demanding answers from the most powerful people. In France, the march forced the royal family to return to Paris, where they would be under closer popular supervision. The psychological impact of the October days was as significant as their practical consequences. Marie Antoinette, who had been a remote figure of fantasy and speculation, was now living in Paris, where ordinary people could see her daily activities. The mystique of monarchy, already damaged by the events of July, was further eroded by this forced intimacy between rulers and ruled. The Queen, in particular, became a focus for popular hatred and suspicion. Her Austrian origins made her suspect as a potential foreign agent, while her reputation for extravagance made her a symbol of aristocratic excess. Whether these perceptions were fair mattered less than their political impact. In revolutionary situations, perception often becomes reality, and Marie Antoinette was perceived as an enemy of the people. The king's position was equally precarious but more complex. Louis XVI was personally decent and well-meaning, but he was also weak and indecisive. His attempts to accommodate revolutionary demands while preserving royal authority satisfied no one. Revolutionaries saw him as an obstacle to necessary change, while royalists viewed his concessions as betrayals of sacred principles. He was trapped in an impossible position by the logic of revolutionary politics. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1789, Paris remained a city on edge. The initial euphoria of revolutionary victory had been replaced by the harder work of creating new institutions and solving practical problems. But the fundamental psychological transformation was irreversible. People who had once accepted their subordinate position in society now expected to have a voice in decisions that affected their lives. This expectation created new forms of political participation that went far beyond formal voting and representation. Neighborhood assemblies met regularly to discuss local issues and coordinate action. Popular societies organized petitions and demonstrations. Working people used strikes and boycotts to press their demands. The revolution had unleashed a wave of democratic participation that traditional political institutions were ill-equipped to handle. The Church's position became increasingly complicated as the revolution progressed. The civil constitution of the clergy, adopted in July 1790, attempted to reorganize the Catholic Church along constitutional lines. Priests and bishops would be elected by their communities, rather than appointed by church hierarchy. church property would be nationalized and sold to pay government debts. These changes challenged fundamental Catholic principles about religious authority and created a schism that would have lasting consequences. Many faithful Catholics found themselves torn between loyalty to the revolution and loyalty to their religious beliefs. The Pope condemned the civil constitution, creating a crisis of conscience for French Catholics. Some priests took the required oath of loyalty to the new system, while others refused and went into hiding or exile. This religious division added another layer of complexity to an already volatile political situation. The economic revolution that accompanied political change was equally dramatic. The abolition of feudalism eliminated centuries-old obligations and restrictions, freeing peasants from various forms of servitude, while also eliminating traditional forms of economic security. The nationalization of church and noble lands created opportunities for some while displacing others. The introduction of free trade principles dismantled guild systems that had regulated economic activity for generations. These changes created winners and losers, and the losers did not always accept their fate quietly. Artisans who had enjoyed guild protection found themselves competing with unrestricted competitors. Peasants who had gained land sometimes lacked the capital needed to work it effectively. Workers who had expected revolutionary change to improve their conditions immediately were disappointed by the slow pace of economic transformation. The assignats, paper money backed by nationalized church lands, represented an innovative attempt to solve the government's financial crisis. But paper money was a new and unfamiliar concept for most French people, who were accustomed to dealing in gold and silver coins. The value of assignats fluctuated based on political developments and public confidence in the revolutionary government, creating additional uncertainty in an already unstable economy. Inflation became a persistent problem as the government printed more and more assignats to meet its expenses. This particularly hurt people living on fixed incomes or savings, including many of the middle-class supporters who had initially backed the revolution. The economic policies designed to fund revolutionary change ended up creating new forms of hardship and discontent. The revolution's impact on daily life in Paris was visible everywhere. Street names were changed to eliminate references to saints and royalty, replaced with names celebrating revolutionary heroes and principles. The revolutionary calendar eliminated Sundays and religious holidays, replacing them with a 10-day week and secular festivals. Even clothing became political, as elaborate aristocratic fashions gave way to simpler styles that demonstrated republican virtue. Language itself was revolutionized as forms of address changed to reflect new egalitarian principles. The formal vous gave way to the familiar tu in many contexts, while titles like monsieur and madame were replaced with citoyen and citoyenne citizen. These linguistic changes might seem trivial, but they reflected and reinforced fundamental alterations in social relationships. The arts and culture were mobilized to serve revolutionary purposes. Painters created images celebrating popular heroes and revolutionary events. Musicians composed songs that could be sung by crowds at political gatherings. Theatre productions were rewritten to eliminate content that might be considered counter-revolutionary. Even fashion became a form of political expression, as clothing styles signaled political allegiances. Education was completely reconceptualized as revolutionary. Leaders recognized that creating new citizens required new forms of learning. Traditional education, dominated by the church and focused on classical languages and religious instruction, was seen as incompatible with Republican values. New curricula emphasized practical skills, scientific knowledge, and civic virtue. The revolution needed citizens who could think for themselves rather than subjects, who would obey without question. But educational reform, like all revolutionary changes, was easier to decree than to implement. Finding qualified teachers who could embody revolutionary principles was difficult. Creating new textbooks and materials required time and resources that were often unavailable. Parents who had grown up under the old system were sometimes suspicious of educational innovations that seemed to threaten traditional values. The medical profession was also transformed by revolutionary principles. The old system of medical education, controlled by traditional universities and guilds, was swept away in favor of new institutions that emphasized practical training and scientific method. This created opportunities for innovation and progress, while also disrupting established patterns of medical care and professional development. Legal reform was another area where revolutionary principles had profound and immediate impact. The complex system of regional laws, aristocratic privileges, and ecclesiastical courts was replaced with a uniform legal code that applied equally to all citizens. This represented a fundamental shift from a legal system based on status and privilege to one based on equal treatment under law. The new courts eliminated the purchase of judicial offices and the hereditary nature of legal positions that had characterized the old regime. Judges would be elected rather than appointed, and legal proceedings would be conducted in French rather than Latin, making the law accessible to ordinary people for the first time. The psychological impact of these changes was enormous. People who had been excluded from justice by language, caste, and social barriers suddenly found themselves with legal rights. They could actually exercise, but the transition from old legal systems to new ones created chaos and uncertainty. Lawyers trained in the old system struggled to adapt to new procedures and principles. Legal disputes that had been pending for years under the old system had to be resolved under completely different rules. The backlog of cases, combined with the shortage of qualified personnel, meant that justice was often delayed or denied entirely. The transformation of Paris itself reflected the broader revolutionary changes sweeping through French society. Public spaces that had once been reserved for the elite were opened to ordinary citizens. The Tuileries Gardens, where aristocrats had once strolled in elaborate costumes, now welcomed working people in their everyday clothes. This democratization of public space had deep symbolic significance, representing the broader principle that society's resources should serve all citizens, rather than just the privileged few. Architecture and urban planning also reflected revolutionary values. Plans were made to create wider streets that would be harder to barricade and more suitable for popular assemblies. Public buildings were redesigned to emphasize accessibility and transparency rather than exclusivity and mystery. The physical environment of Paris was being reshaped to support democratic participation rather than aristocratic privilege. The marketplace became a particularly important space for revolutionary politics. Food markets had always been centers of popular communication, but they now became forums for political debate and organization. Market women, who had played crucial roles in revolutionary activities, continued to exercise significant influence over public opinion and political developments. Their networks of communication and mutual support provided crucial infrastructure for revolutionary organizing. Religious life in Paris was completely transformed by revolutionary changes. Churches that had dominated neighborhood life for centuries found their role fundamentally altered. Some were closed entirely, others were converted to secular purposes, and those that remained open operated under government supervision. The relationship between spiritual authority and political power, which had been taken for granted for over 1,000 years, was completely redefined. The psychological impact of these religious changes was particularly profound for older Parisians, who had grown up when the church was an unquestioned authority in daily life. Suddenly, priests were being required to swear political oaths, religious holidays were being eliminated, and sacred spaces were being used for secular purposes. For many, this felt like the complete overturning of the natural order. But for others, particularly younger people and those who had been marginalized by traditional religious hierarchies, the changes were liberating. Women who had been excluded from formal religious authority found new opportunities for spiritual expression. Minority religious groups that had faced persecution under the Catholic monarchy found new tolerance under the revolutionary government. The revolution's commitment to religious liberty, whatever its practical limitations, represented a fundamental break with centuries of religious uniformity. The role of violence in the revolution remained a constant source of tension and debate. The storming of the Bastille had demonstrated that popular violence could achieve political goals, but it had also unleashed forces that were difficult to control. Throughout the latter months of 1789, incidents of crowd violence continued to occur, sometimes directed at legitimate targets, but sometimes victimizing innocent people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Revolutionary leaders found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to harness popular energy while preventing it from degenerating into chaos. They needed the threat of popular violence to intimidate their opponents, but they also needed order and stability to build new institutions. This tension between revolution and governance would persist throughout the revolutionary period, and beyond, the international dimensions of the French Revolution continued to complicate domestic politics throughout 1789 and beyond. Foreign governments watched French developments with increasing alarm, recognizing that revolutionary ideas posed a fundamental threat to their own legitimacy. The possibility of foreign intervention added urgency to revolutionary activities, while also providing justification for increasingly authoritarian measures. Émigrés, nobles who had fled France, established communities in neighboring countries where they plotted counter-revolution and sought foreign support for restoring the old regime. Their very existence was a constant reminder that the revolution had enemies who would never accept its legitimacy. This external threat helped to radicalize revolutionary politics by making compromise seem like betrayal. The revolution's impact on gender relations was complex and contradictory. Women had participated actively in revolutionary activities and had demonstrated their political capacity through actions like the March to Versailles. But the new political system excluded them from formal participation while also disrupting traditional social structures that had provided some forms of protection and support. Revolutionary ideology emphasized individual rights and equal citizenship, but these principles were not extended to women. This contradiction created tensions that would persist throughout the revolutionary period. Some women, like Olympe de Gouges, demanded full political equality, while others focused on economic and social issues that affected their daily lives more directly. The revolutionary transformation of marriage and family law reflected broader changes in social relationships. The new government introduced civil marriage and divorce, challenging the Catholic Church's control over family life. These changes gave individuals, particularly women, greater autonomy over their personal relationships while also undermining traditional sources of social stability, children's lives were also transformed by revolutionary changes. The emphasis on creating new citizens required new approaches to childhood and education. Traditional forms of apprenticeship and family-based learning were supplemented or replaced by formal schooling designed to instill republican values. Children were encouraged to see themselves as citizens of the nation, rather than simply members of families or local communities. The revolutionary government's financial situation remained precarious throughout 1789 and beyond. Despite the nationalization of church property and the introduction of new taxes, the state continued to struggle with enormous debts inherited from the old regime. The costs of revolutionary transformation, including the need to maintain public order and defend against foreign threats, added to these financial pressures. The assignats, paper money backed by nationalized lands, provided temporary relief but also created new problems. As more assignats were printed to meet government expenses, their value declined, creating inflation that hurt people living on fixed incomes. The revolutionary government found itself caught between the need for revenue and the political costs of the economic policies required to generate that revenue. Economic inequality, which had been one of the primary causes of the revolution, proved difficult to eliminate through political means alone. While the revolution had abolished feudalism and eliminated many aristocratic privileges, it had not fundamentally altered the economic structures that generated inequality. Some people benefited enormously from revolutionary changes, particularly those who could purchase nationalized lands or take advantage of new commercial opportunities. Others found their situations unchanged or even worsened by the disruption of traditional economic relationships. The urban working class, which had provided much of the muscle for revolutionary activities, found that political revolution did not automatically translate into economic improvement. Wages remained low, working conditions remained difficult, and unemployment continued to be a persistent problem. This created ongoing tensions between revolutionary leaders, who were primarily concerned with political change, and working people, who needed immediate improvements in their material conditions. The sans-culottes, as the urban working people came to be known, developed their own political agenda that went beyond the moderate reforms favored by bourgeois revolutionary leaders. They demanded price controls on essential goods, progressive taxation, and direct democracy that would give them real influence over government policy. Their political activities, including mass demonstrations and petitions, kept pressure on the revolutionary government to address social and economic issues. The countryside around Paris was also transformed by revolutionary changes, though often in ways that differed from urban experiences. The abolition of feudalism eliminated various forms of peasant obligations while also disrupting traditional systems of rural organization. Some peasants gained access to land through the sale of nationalized property, while others found themselves worse off as traditional forms of mutual support and protection disappeared. Rural communities had their own ways of interpreting and implementing revolutionary principles. Village assemblies became forums for local self-governance, while traditional forms of collective action were adapted to serve revolutionary purposes. The relationship between Paris and the surrounding countryside, always complex, became even more complicated as revolutionary changes created new forms of urban-rural tension. The revolution's impact on commerce and trade was equally complex. The elimination of internal tariffs and guild restrictions opened new opportunities for commercial development, while also disrupting established business relationships. Merchants who had prospered under the old system of regulated trade found themselves competing in unfamiliar free market conditions. Others discovered new opportunities in the chaos of revolutionary transformation. International trade was particularly affected by the political instability and the threat of foreign intervention. French merchants found it difficult to maintain commercial relationships with foreign partners who were uncertain about the revolutionary government's stability and legitimacy. This economic isolation added to the financial pressures facing the revolutionary state. The cultural revolution that accompanied political change was visible in every aspect of Parisian life. Traditional festivals and celebrations were replaced with new civic ceremonies designed to celebrate revolutionary achievements and instill republican values. The Festival of Federation, held in July 1792, commemorated the first anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, brought together people from across France in a massive celebration of national unity. These new festivals served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities for popular participation in political culture. They helped to create shared memories and common identities, and they demonstrated the government's commitment to democratic principles. But they also revealed tensions within revolutionary society, as different groups tried to use these occasions to advance their own political agendas. The transformation of popular culture was equally significant. Traditional songs and stories were rewritten to reflect revolutionary themes, while new forms of entertainment emerged to serve revolutionary purposes. Political songs that could be sung by crowds at demonstrations became particularly important tools for communication and mobilization. The press continued to play a crucial role in revolutionary politics, with hundreds of newspapers and pamphlets representing every conceivable political viewpoint. This explosion of printed material democratized access to information while also creating new forms of political division and conflict. Readers could choose publications that confirmed their existing beliefs, while ignoring those that challenged their assumptions, creating echo chambers that reinforced political polarization. Literacy rates, which had been low under the old regime, began to increase as revolutionary governments promoted education and as political participation required basic reading skills. This expansion of literacy had profound long-term consequences for French society, creating a more informed and politically engaged population, while also making propaganda and political manipulation more sophisticated. The revolution's approach to science and technology reflected broader commitments to reason and progress. Traditional institutions like the Royal Academies were reformed or replaced with new organizations, based on merit rather than aristocratic privilege. This created opportunities for scientific advancement, while also disrupting established patterns of research and communication. Medical knowledge and practice were particularly affected by revolutionary changes. The old system of medical guilds and inherited privileges was swept away in favor of new institutions that emphasized practical training and scientific method. This created opportunities for innovation and improvement, while also disrupting established patterns of medical care. The legal profession underwent similar transformations as the old system of purchased offices and hereditary positions was replaced with elected judges and merit-based appointments. This democratization of legal authority was designed to make justice more accessible to ordinary people. But it also created practical problems as inexperienced officials struggled to master complex legal procedures. As 1789 drew to a close, Paris had been fundamentally transformed from the city it had been at the beginning of the year. The physical appearance remained largely the same, but the social relationships, political structures, and cultural patterns that gave the city its character had been revolutionized. People walked the same streets, but they walked them as citizens, rather than subjects, with new rights and responsibilities that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The psychological transformation was even more profound than the institutional changes. People who had spent their entire lives accepting their subordinate positions in society had discovered that they could challenge authority, organize collectively, and achieve political goals through their own actions. This discovery was intoxicating and empowering, but it was also frightening and destabilizing. The old certainties that had organized social life for centuries had been swept away, but new certainties had not yet emerged to replace them. French society was in a state of revolutionary transition, caught between a past that had been rejected and a future that remained undefined. This uncertainty created both opportunities and dangers that would shape French history for generations to come. The winter of 1789-1790 would test the revolution's staying power as practical problems demanded practical solutions. Revolutionary enthusiasm could inspire people to extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice, but it could not solve the fundamental economic and social problems that had caused the revolution in the first place. The real work of creating a new society was just beginning, and that work would prove to be far more difficult and dangerous than storming the Bastille had been. The fear that had characterized Paris at the beginning of 1789 had been transformed but not eliminated. Instead of fearing royal oppression, people now feared counter-revolution, foreign invasion, and the collapse of the new order they had worked so hard to create. The revolution had given them hope, but it had also given them new things to worry about that as church bells rang across Paris to welcome the new year of 1790. The city's inhabitants could look back on 12 months that had changed everything. They had witnessed the birth of a new world, but they had also learned that creating that world would require sustained effort, difficult choices, and continued vigilance. The revolution had succeeded in destroying the old regime, but the harder task of building a new one lay ahead. The story of Paris in 1789 is ultimately a story about the power of ordinary people to change history when they decide they can no longer tolerate the intolerable. It is a story about fear transformed into courage, desperation channeled into action, and individual suffering converted into collective power. It is also a story about the unintended consequences of revolutionary change and the difficulty of controlling forces once they have been unleashed. The events of 1789 would echo through French history and world history for centuries to come. The principles proclaimed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen would inspire liberation movements around the globe. The example of popular revolution would terrify rulers and inspire subjects everywhere. The modern world, with all its promises and contradictions, was born in the streets of Paris in that terrifying and transformative year of 1789. Tonight, as we close this examination of one of history's most dramatic and consequential years, we are reminded that the comfortable certainties we take for granted can disappear with shocking suddenness. The people of Paris in 1789 learned that lesson in the most visceral way possible. They discovered that when enough people decide to say no to oppression, even the most powerful institutions can crumble. They also discovered that revolution, once begun, follows its own logic and takes its participants to destinations they never intended to reach. The legacy of 1789 continues to shape our world today. The ideas unleashed in the streets of Paris, The precedents established by popular revolution and the questions raised about justice, equality, and human dignity remain as relevant now as they were over 2 centuries ago. We are all, in some sense, children of the French Revolution, inheritors of both its promises and its problems. The Terror of Paris in 1789 was not just the terror of violence and chaos, though there was certainly plenty of both. It was the terror of fundamental change, of watching a familiar world disappear and an unfamiliar one emerge in its place. It was the terror of discovering that the institutions and beliefs that had seemed permanent and unchangeable were actually fragile human constructs that could be overturned by human action. But it was also the terror of possibility, the frightening and exhilarating realization that ordinary people could shape their own destinies and create new forms of human society. That terror, in all its complexity and contradiction, continues to haunt and inspire us today. The revolution that began in Paris in 1789 is not yet finished, and perhaps it never will be. The questions it raised about human dignity, social justice, and political legitimacy remain as urgent now as they were when the first stones were thrown at the Bastille on that fateful July morning. This is why Paris was absolutely terrifying in 1789. Not because of the violence, though the violence was real and shocking. Not because of the chaos, though the chaos was profound and destabilizing. Paris was terrifying because it showed the world that change was possible, that the future did not have to resemble the past, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they decided to use it. That lesson, once learned, could never be unlearned. The world would never be the same